Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
The humble opinion poll. It has become an arrow of most significance in the quiver of any type of leadership. Polling results dominate our daily dialogue. Their results tend to be the lead of lead stories and are indivisible with the fabric of any type of public policy or private decision-making. Welcome again, and thank you for watching the most widely watched source of Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William, and this time, pollsters and political science. What do the tea leaves really tell us, and how much does this practice push or pull elected leaders' direction and final outcomes? We will hear directly from the source of those that drive and analyze the numbers. Please stay tuned.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded January 17th, 2014. On this week's program, Dr. Ken Fernandez of Elon University, Dr. Scott Huffmon of Winthrop University, Tom Jensen from Public Policy Polling, and Dr. Dave Woodard from Clemson University. Now, here's Chris William.
Welcome to our program. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. I've been looking forward to this discussion for better or for worse. Let's talk about the science of polling. Scott, we'll start with you. You've been on this program. It's been a while, but you've been on this program before. But what is methodology around polling? You know, we see the results of polls on TV screens, on computer screens, on the front page of publications, but how has the methodology, how does that square with the science of it all?
Well, the methodology has evolved greatly over the past several years. It used to be everyone had a landline, and now, over a third of the people do not have landlines, 35% or even higher. And among younger Americans and minorities, it's even much higher than that. So that has evolved, and it's harder to get folks. But also, the methodology has to keep pace with the time, in that you have to be able to not only get those folks, but people aren't answering the phone whenever you went from no caller ID to caller ID. It's always evolving, and there's always research being conducted on what's the best methodology to make sure you get your population. And getting the population, sometimes you go from registered voter lists, but if you're not doing a likely voter poll, you just do a random sample of the population plus cell phones. So your methodology depends on the population you want to look at, and it's ever evolving with technology.
You know, Tom, you've got specific ways of doing it, and yours has been widely either criticized or supported. You've got some great results. You can't argue with that. You've changed some of your methodology. You hear Scott talk. How do you reflect on that? How do you characterize the methodology versus the science of it all?
Well, really, I think what increasingly is changing is there is not one single way you can reach everybody in the American population. It used to be that you could go to everybody's house, and that was how polls were done 50 years ago, door-to-door visits, and you could reach everyone that way. And then for decades, you could reach everybody on a landline telephone. That's just not possible anymore. So we've made a change for 2014 where we're combining traditional landline telephone interviews with also reaching people who don't have landlines over the internet to interview them that way. And we're finding that that helps us to reach younger people in a way that traditional landline calls just doesn't.
Can you be sure of the credibility of the person on the internet, though? Can you vouch for the same credibility if you have somebody on the phone and you can check?
The people who put these internet panels together are pretty painstaking in making sure that these are real people and that sort of thing. And of course, at the end of the day, we still have to do a lot of waiting on the back end to make sure that the people we're polling are representative of the overall population.
How does this run against you, Dave, or Ken? Please jump in here.
Well, it's a lot harder to poll than it used to be, what you've already said. It's more complicated nowadays, and people don't tell you as much. At one time, it was flattering to get a call from a pollster. Now then, I think people kind of resent them. I think people don't always tell you the truth, especially when you ask likely voters, are you likely to vote? I don't really think that most of the people vote sometimes who tell us they're going to vote. So it's harder nowadays. And I think polls are less reliable than they may have been in the 60s and 70s.
Really?
Yeah, I think then they had one demographic phone calls you could probably get through if you had enough money to do it. I think now then the combination of technology makes it harder to tell. You saw that in 2012. It was harder to make predictions than it was before.
The response rate, right, is just dropping every year, right? When I was growing up, you had one landline, you didn't have call waiting, you didn't have caller ID, and you answered the phone if you were home 100% of the time. It's not happening now. And, you know, I'm from a generation where you did surveys from mail and telephone, and you scoffed at the idea of the internet, right, because it wasn't a random sample. But now, you know, if you look at YouGov and these things, they're in the top 4, top 10 in predictions, and you can do a lot of them, and you can follow people. And so a lot of academics who really scoffed at online surveys have really sort of reconsidered these things as an option because the response rate of telephone surveys have dropped so low that it is no longer a random sample.
And to follow up on that, I'm glad you brought that up. When I teach my survey methodology class, the textbook we use actually has a line where it says, and you can expect a 50% response rate. And I was apoplectic. And I told the students, I said, and I love this book, everything about this book, but this is, I may have used some words that I shouldn't have used in the classroom. I said the response rates are going to be, you know, for us, they're going to be closer to 15 to 20 when we're polling South Carolina. In general, they're probably going to be closer to 10. And 2 months later, Pew came out and said they were 9. So, you know, it really is much harder to get folks to take a poll these days, which is why the sampling and getting at the right folks is all that much more important.
You know, I find this interesting. And Dave, back to something you said. You said, you know, it's just not reliable as it was back in the 60s and 70s. So, you know, square that with the idea that now the science of what polling is, or the methodology, seems to affect the arc of leadership pretty dramatically, that leaders won't move until they have a poll.
Well, and if they do, they regret it. For instance, George W. Bush going to Iraq and not looking at the poll numbers, and it was really deadly for him. And I think what happens more and more is that there's paralysis of analysis by politicians because we get different results. Should I really do this? Should I really not do this? But I don't know whether all those polls are all that reliable sometimes, especially when it comes to particular policies, because policies evolve and they change over time. So it's hard. It's much harder, I think, in office to use polls than it is at elections. Scott and I sort of specialize in elections. One story quickly from that. In 2012, we're limited by money, how much we can spend, how many calls we can make each night. After the debates in South Carolina, when Newt Gingrich did so well early in the week, we had Romney ahead. We had to throw out all the data, start all over, burn the house down about 3 or 4 nights, try and call as much as we could. People don't ever look at your methodology. We had a very small N on that sample, about 500, and we were really trying to get closer to 8 or 9 because we had to change it. And it's expensive, it's time-consuming, and the public opinion changes rapidly. In that 2012 election, within 4 days, the election was decided. Nikki Haley's governor's race turned around after the endorsement from Sarah Palin. So you're measuring, something dramatic happens, everything changes.
You know, I really want to get to some specific races and the issues in 2014. Before we do that, Tom, in North Carolina, you got about 10 million people, but yet the polling sample is 600 to 800 folks. How do you interpolate that? How do you make the case that that is an accurate measure of in such a small, negligible amount?
Well, one thing that's really interesting and that's particularly difficult for pollsters with the declining response rates is that everybody is not equally likely to answer a poll. Women answer polls at a much higher rate than men. White people
Consistently?
Yep. Yes. White people answer polls at a much higher rate than African Americans and Latinos, and older people answer polls at a much higher rate than younger people. So the reason we saw so much variability in the polls, especially in 2012, where some said Obama was going to win, some said Romney was going to win, we have to take that raw data that we get that isn't necessarily representative of the population as a whole and weight it to something that is representative of what we think the turnout's going to be in a state like North Carolina. When you have Mitt Romney winning white voters by 30 points and Barack Obama winning black voters by 90 points, the difference between weighting your poll to have, say, 22% African Americans or just 20% African Americans can be the difference between having Obama up by 2 or Romney up by 2. And those kinds of decisions are becoming more and more important to accurate polls.
And to your point, when does a poll become a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Well, I don't know that they ever really become self-fulfilling prophecies. Sometimes, we'll put out a poll and say Obama's winning, and then Obama wins, and people will come to us and say, well, people voted for Obama because your poll said Obama was winning. That's not really true.
Chicken or egg. And I want to get to something about, you asked about the sample size. And that's why we talk so much about the sampling, methodology, and weighting. And I always explain it to my students this way. When you go to the physician to have tests run, they don't take all your blood. They take a sample because every bit of your blood perfectly samples all the elements in it. So if we make our sample so that all elements are properly represented, then the statistics, the math behind it shows that if we have a good sample, if we have good weights, then it is really representative of the larger population.
You know, I'm a little concerned about you talking about apoplectic and blood samples. You keep bringing this back to physical maladies. It must be tough in the class for this guy. Go ahead,
Now,
Counsel.
what saves election polls is that you have a response bias, right? Not everyone answers a survey at the same rate, but not everyone goes to the polls at the same rate. So those same biases sort of match the voter turnout. So that saves these telephone surveys, and that's why a lot of these telephone surveys have been accurate. And when Nate Silver sort of aggregate these, you're able to predict all 50 states how they win based on telephone surveys. Because again, you're not getting a average citizen, you're getting an average registered voter or likely voter. So that response bias doesn't kill you because there's a bias in who goes to the polls.
Is it just quickly, and I want to get on to some of the issues and some of the political races, is aggregating polls, is polling of polls, is that diffusing the whole idea of polling?
I mean, more data is more accurate, right? And so that's the nice thing about it. One poll because of a margin of error, and then of course you can also be outside of that error just by dumb luck. So when you aggregate all these different polls, and I mean, I don't know how many PPP did, was it 60 polls in the presidential election in North Carolina? I can't remember. When you have all that data, you can then get an accurate pinpoint. And
a single poll may be an outlier. Bring them all together, the average brings those outliers in, and you get a truer picture.
And let me just say, I'm really glad when Scott polls and I poll and we say the same thing.
yeah.
So Winthrop and Clemson.
That's right. Helps us a lot.
Okay. Let's talk about Congress. It hit a low point. It was all over the media. The approval rating for Congress has been a low point in decades. Have we hit a tipping point here? Meaning, there was a national poll that talked about, no longer are we saying that, Congress is at fault, but I like my congressman or congresswoman. Have we hit a tipping point? Is there a mortal wound now in how people feel about Congress, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, it couldn't get much lower, but it's still not going to lead to that much change this fall just because the way that the district lines are drawn up nationally, there's so few districts that are really competitive. So you may be mad at your congressman, but there's just not really an alternative for you to vote for. But it's definitely true. Congress may be at a 6-7% approval rating. Your individual congressman is still, we're finding, at about a 40% approval rating. So you don't exactly hate Congress and love your congressman, but you hate Congress and probably you don't hate your congressman enough to vote him out.
You might find some surprises in primaries, but not necessarily in the general election.
90% of incumbents who run for re-election are going to get re-elected this time, just like every other time. It's the open seats. But as Tom pointed out, there are only 20 or so that are considered toss-ups by, I think, Rothenberg. So there's not going to be that many incumbents who are running kicked out. Any change is going to come from open seats, probably.
Yeah. But we are seeing some challenges in primaries. And I think what we're seeing is conservatives upset with Republicans. So even though the Republicans are going to win in the general election, they're having to face a narrower electorate in a primary. And that's what's really challenging, because a congressman can never tell primary election is a very unique electorate. Only 20% are going to vote. They're going to be very intense. They're not like the general election at all. And so they're being very cautious. They're afraid to draw a challenger in the primary.
Dave, thank you for that setup, and thank you for that segue, because let's talk about that. Lindsey Graham in South Carolina this fall, Kay Hagan in North Carolina this fall. Let's start with Graham. How much at risk, and what do you predict is going to happen with Lindsey Graham?
I think Scott and I both agree. I think we're both surprised that he drew the kind of attention that he did. He has 4 challengers.
In his race?
Primary. Yes.
In a primary race.
In a primary race where neither Tim Scott nor Nikki Haley did. And the intensity of it. I mean, GOP executive committees in South Carolina are voting no confidence in Lindsey Graham. But that's a pretty significant thing. I still think he's relatively safe. I think the thing that might happen is because the 50% barrier has to be crossed in the primary, that he might be held under that and have to go to a runoff.
With so many other people
That's
in
right.
the race, that the vote's just going to be so diffused. There's a good chance he could be under 50%. You know, and the anger, the enmity towards Lindsey Graham is driven by those folks who are further out on the right. As Tom pointed out, you know, you look at some of these folks, and a lot of voters are like, well, I don't hate them, they're kind of okay. People who kind of like you aren't likely to show up in a primary, even though they'd vote for you in the general election. So what you end up having is a lot of Tea Party-driven anger. The interesting thing is the Tea Party only makes up about 6% of the overall population in South Carolina. But if you go to any of these GOP county meetings, they are the predominant number. They are the majority at those meetings, and those are the people who are getting the leaders of the county parties to write those letters.
That's right.
That you're talking about with, you know, anger towards Lindsey Graham. So a lot of this is being driven by a very small, very loud segment, but that small, loud segment is also the most likely to turn out.
Is that Tea Party, is it, figuratively, is their stock still rising?
I don't think their stock is rising, but I think the sympathy for them is rising. In my polls, I've found that, like Scott, only about 6-7% people are members of the Tea Party, go to Tea Party, but when you ask, are you sympathetic with the Tea Party, you get up 60-70%.
Yeah, especially among Republicans, it's way up there.
Way up there. So even though they don't particularly like them, maybe even agree with them, they don't want them to stop either. And they don't discourage challengers to incumbents in Republican primaries.
How about Kay Hagan in North Carolina, Tom?
The North Carolina Senate race has been incredibly volatile for being this far out from the election. Over the summer...
Surprisingly so to you?
Yeah, I've never seen something like this. Over the summer, voters were extremely unhappy with the Republicans in the legislature, and Kay Hagan's most likely opponent's a Republican in the legislature, so all of a sudden, she was leading by 15 points, looking like a pretty good favorite for re-election. Then with the Obamacare debacle, with the rollout, that's completely fallen apart for her. She's gone from a year ago being up by about 5 against Tillis to over the summer being up by about 15. Now it's basically a tie race. Voters are very unhappy about Obamacare and taking it out on Hagan. You just usually don't see shifts this big so far away from the election.
Is that, in all of your opinion, when you have that kind of volatility so early in an election cycle for a particular seat, what does that spell to you? What do you think? That it's can go any way, or does it say something else?
The incumbent advantage in the U.S. Senate tends to be smaller than the U.S. House, but it's still about 80%. And Hagan has a giant campaign fund, so she can spend a lot of money. The question is, will Tillis come out, be able to fund and get name recognition and challenge an incumbent? This is a battleground state in North Carolina, and Romney was able to pull it off. I think, in a midterm election, Republicans have a slight advantage. I think Hagan is very worried.
Well, and one of the things that I think leads to the volatility is this far out. It's very difficult to, especially when you're going to have a close race, it's very difficult to peg those likely voters this far out from the election. Research on likely voters a long way out from the election has shown two things. A lot of people, as Dave alluded to, say, yeah, I'm going to vote, don't vote. But the interesting thing is there are also a lot of people who say, no, I probably won't vote, who do vote. The volatility from difficulty in measuring likely voters a long way out, I think, contributes to polls early on kind of being all over the map. But they do tend to centralize very accurately the closer to the election.
Once you get past the primary and sort of the challengers already identified, that volatility starts to stabilize.
Yeah.
How much does the Obama affect Kay Hagan in North Carolina this year?
It's huge. Barack Obama's approval rating dropped 10 points over the last 3 or 4 months. Kay Hagan's approval rating dropped 10 points over the last 3 or 4 months. When you look at the approval numbers in North Carolina for Obamacare and for Kay Hagan, the numbers are almost identical. That issue has really defined her over the last 3 months, and if she's going to get reelected, I think she really needs the topic of conversation to move on to something else. When Obamacare's in the spotlight, things are not going well for Democrats. But I think one really interesting thing to think about in terms of this race, North Carolina was the second closest state in the country in the presidential race in both 2008 and 2012. I think we're going to be the first or second closest Senate race in the country this year as well. The changing demographics in North Carolina have just made it so that when you talk about those most competitive states in the country, where generally you've thought about Florida, Ohio, moving forward, North Carolina is probably going to be on that list as well.
The hardest thing to predict is turnout.
Oh, yeah.
It's so hard to predict who's actually going to vote.
You mean
And that-
total number turnout, total number of voter turnout?
Yeah, they keep
Percentage and composition.
flexing, yeah, that's right. What they look like and everything is so hard to present, and that can turn the whole election around as to who actually decides to vote.
You know, is there, Dave, it's not to interrupt you, but is there a magic bullet for turnout?
I wish there was. I don't know what it
No,
is.
places like Pew, Gallup, I mean, some of these places have developed, 18 question series. And then there's been research to show that if you just use 1 or 2 screens cutting off with one particular answer, it's just as accurate. This is being constantly researched, but the short answer is no. There's no single magic bullet to show who's going to
The
turn out.
weather will affect turnouts. There's just so many factors that are just can't be calculated. It's very difficult.
You know, if there were higher voter turnout in general for elections, I mean, not the dismal numbers that we see now across this country, but would results be dramatically different, or would there just be more people turning out at the polls? Would it be more Republican? Would it be more Democrat?
It'd be more Democrats.
So
Democrats are less likely to turn out than Republicans. South Carolina, people have a hard time believing this, but there are basically almost as many self-identified Democrats as are self-identified Republicans. They're just much less likely to show up. Now, among independents, the leaners are much more likely to be Republican. So you combine those two things, that gives the Republican advantage in South Carolina. But if absolutely everybody turned out, it would make things a lot closer in states that are certainly Republican dominated.
Let me hit leadership in South Carolina, because we talked about North Carolina. Governor Haley, is she at risk?
Not at all.
Yeah.
I think so.
Safe, good margins?
Tim Scott, same way.
Yeah.
He's not really well known, but he's safe, I think.
And in North Carolina, Governor McCrory's not up for election, but it's been a tough year, last 12 months. How does that affect what goes on the next year or two?
It's a good question. I mean, there's some issues that may haunt him, like voter ID. You saw like 75% supporting voter identification, but then just recently when we polled last fall, we saw that a majority of Democrats actually now oppose voter ID, and this becomes an issue that may drive people to the poll. When you start threatening to take people's right to vote away, then they start getting really interested in turning out, and that actually could help Democrats.
Yeah. North Carolina?
Yeah, I think what Governor McCrory and the Republicans in the legislature saw last summer was that when they pursued a really ambitious agenda, they made voters really mad, and their poll numbers tanked, and voters have started to sort of forget about some of that, and their numbers are creeping back up. But I would expect that in this year's legislative session, they're going to end up not doing a whole lot because they don't want to upset the apple cart again like they did last summer, going right into an election. I think that they'll come into the short session and do a few things and then go home and campaign and just try not to make anybody too mad in Raleigh this year.
Tom, this is not an endorsement of the Republicans or endorsement against the Republicans, but it seems like the Republicans almost didn't pay attention to polls and made decisions.
That's true. They did. And it made voters mad. But that doesn't mean it's right or wrong. One interesting thing, we talk about voters leading by the polls. When Barack Obama came out and said that he supported gay marriage, we were still finding that voters across the country opposed gay marriage by a pretty significant margin. But what we found is that his support of gay marriage has moved the polls by virtue of his leadership. We've seen, for instance, that African American voters who were very reluctant to support gay marriage after Obama came out in support of it changed their mind and said, if Obama's good with this, we're good with this too. So that's sort of an example of how politicians don't just respond to polls, they can actually lead to changes in the polls as well.
We saw the same thing with immigration and the pathway to citizenship. We saw changes once people started coming out, Republicans and Democrats, bring this up to the issue. You saw the public changing their attitudes and being more supportive of the policy.
Ken, we're out of time. Wish we had more time because we didn't even talk about what is the most critical issue, but please come back. everything from the gas tax to education to politics. We'll do it again. But thank you for being on the program. Scott, good to have you back. And gentlemen, welcome. And you are always welcome to come back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Dave. Thank you for watching our program. Hope your weekend and your business is good. Until then, I'm Chris William. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care, when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.